This will hopefully build on what we've heard before. It's a presentation that Alyssa and I put together that will be basically two parts. The first is a sort of a presentation on the interactions between birds and plants. We hear a lot about how birds need plants, but we don't hear so much about how the plants need birds. So I'm going to talk about sort of coevolution of birds and plants for a bit, and then I'll talk and give you some more specific examples of things that on-the-ground projects that people can do to provide cover and food and water in various scales on the landscape. And the idea here is to think about this concept of green oases in urbans, and we're going to define urban in a broader sense, not just the inner city environment, but the suburban as well. And there's lots of scales of this. There's, of course, the larger scale parks. There's the smaller scale gardens. There's the scale down to the individual plants and how they interact with the birds and specific things you can do. Because, in fact, when it really comes down to it, despite the scale of the land, sometimes one specific thing is limiting the presence or absence of birds on that piece of land, and it may be as simple as a nest box that's got the wrong size hole in it, and that might make all the difference whether a species is there or not. And I'll discuss some of those things as we talk about birds in the urban environment. To a lot of people, birds are attracted to people by feeders, and I'm not going to talk much about this except that I want to dispel one myth, and that is that bird feeding, in my view at least, is not a requirement for most kinds of birds. That there's usually plenty of food in the environment aside from bird feeders, and we're much better off encouraging people to create natural habitats for birds which provide not just food for a few species as bird feeders do, but provides food for a huge range of species, including all the insect eaters, which rarely benefit at bird feeders. And of course, by planting habitats, creating habitats, mimicking natural habitats in the city, we not provide food, but we provide cover and nesting places, singing perches, as well as shelter in extreme weather. And so what did birds do before bird feeders? Life before a bird feeder. And how about those grosbeaks? What were they doing before there was black oil sunflower seed anyways? Because that's such a recent phenomenon in their world. If you look at what the grosbeaks eat, they eat a lot of things, but one of their favorites are maples. And among those favorite maples is the sugar maple. And when we think about trying to provide plants for birds, it's important to realize that when you do something like planting a sugar maple, you're doing something not just for birds at that moment, but you're doing something for generations of birds to come. In fact, much of landscape and habitat restoration, we won't actually see the true value of it in our lifetimes. Even though we are long-lived species, many of the changes that we want to create, the best of the changes are changes that will benefit future human generations. Planting a sugar maple is certainly something we do for the future as much as for the present. And of course, that will benefit those future generations of birds. Through this talk, will be encouraging people to think about taking lessons from nature and mimicking those lessons on different scales of habitat, because we can learn a lot, but we have to take some observations. It helps to be a careful observer of nature and to bring some of those general observations into backyards. And one of the things that I've liked to do over the years is to plant native plants. And recently, Alyssa and I bought a house outside of Ithaca, and we chose that place in part because it has some beautiful natural habitats on it. And one of the most attractive things was the entrance driveway, which is lined in those sugar maples. So bringing native plants into our backyards and properties is something that helps birds. There are about a dozen species of birds in particular that specialize in distributing fruits of native plants. But there are about 300 kinds of trees, shrubs, vines, and ground covers that depend exclusively on birds to distribute their seeds. These are plants that include some of the most abundant plants that are out there. Most of the kinds of crabapples and hawthorns and service berries and cherries and many others depend on birds to distribute their seeds for the simple fact that if the seeds just fall onto the parent plant, they're doomed. And so plants, whether it's a little ground cover or a vine or a mighty oak tree, they require to move the seeds away from the parent plant because those seeds are doomed if gravity just carries them to the ground. There's not sunlight. The young plants would be competing for food from their parents, and they would be just crowded out. So birds are the sort of ultimate distributors of seeds. They're great at distributing seeds for several reasons. They don't have teeth, first of all, and so they don't destroy the seeds as mammals do, particularly rodents that chew through seeds and actually get through the flesh and actually destroy the seeds typically. Birds also, because they do their best to maintain their light weight, they pass food rapidly through their system. So they're like eating constantly to maintain that 102-degree temperature we heard about earlier. They have a high metabolism. They're constantly eating. They're flying, and so they're distributing seeds everywhere as they move away. Also, they've got a structure called a gizzard, which means that the seeds pass through their throat and down into their digestive tract, and as they go through the gizzard scrapes away the fleshy coats and improves the chances of germination. Of all the birds, and I mentioned about a dozen, the catbird, like I just showed you, was one of those, but the cedar waxwing is the ultimate fruit distributor. It's about 70% of its diet consists of fruit. So it's one of the best. And it got its name from its close association with cedar trees. This picture shows red cedars growing along a fence row. It doesn't take a lot of imagination to picture the cedar waxwings or some other kind of bird sitting on this at various times and leaving behind a trail of cedars that have grown in the protection of the fence row. When a cedar seed passes through the gut of a bird, the digestive tract of the bird, first the gizzard scrapes away the fleshy coat, and then the acids in its stomach further leach away the waxy coating on the fruits, permitting the seed to grow. Every red cedar you see growing out there, you can be sure has passed through the digestive tract of a bird. You wouldn't have red cedars if it wasn't for birds like cedar waxwings. And what's the cedar waxwing get? It gets the nourishment, but also they nest in the cedar trees. And this is not just about small fruits, even larger fruits like acorns. Here's a scrub jay. Not a bird of upstate New York, but Florida in the west, and our blue jay does the same. They carry away the acorns, and they're fantastic at being able to remember where they bury the acorns. They cache seeds, as most of our birds in the temperate climates do. When they find an abundant source of food, they hide it, whether it's a chickadee or a titmouse, nuthatch, jay, they hide seeds. But in the case of the jays, when they move these big acorns and they bury them, they don't come back and get them all. And if you look at the distribution of oaks, sometimes you find a lot of oaks about the same age coming up in a particular area, or a lot of hickory nuts that are coming up in a certain area, probably because the actions of birds, or in some cases squirrels that have buried these nuts as well. Of course, if the barrier dies, then the whole cache may turn out to be the future generation. So birds do a lot of distributing of food, of seeds and nuts. Now, when we're thinking about improving habitat for birds, this grasshopper sparrow is holding an insect, which is a reminder that even though it has a seed-eating beak, it's eating an insect. Most birds feed their young insects and eat a lot of insects themselves because the insects are high in protein. They don't get as much protein from seeds as they do from insects. And likewise, you see an insect-eating bird like this Nashville warbler. It's got a specialized insect-eating beak, but it doesn't just eat insects. It eats fruit as well. In the fall, it switches its diet to fats. Well, I mention this because if we're trying to improve habitat for birds, we need to think about all the needs and realize that birds eat different kinds of foods at different times of year. it's important to vary the kinds of foods to meet their nutritional needs. And not only vary the kinds of foods like plants or insects, but provide different kinds of plants at different seasons. It may come as a surprise, though, that in the fall, most insect-eating birds, even birds like pileated woodpeckers, will switch to fruit in the fall. And some of their favorite fruits are the high-fat fruits, sometimes called high-lipid fruits, because these fruits have evolved fats in their fleshy fruits that nourish birds. This is flowering dogwood, one of my favorites, one of the classic bird-distributed plants. Let's think about its fruits, which show up just in the fall. In fact, they show up just at the peak of migration. They don't show up much before the peak or much after the peak. Over time, there's been selection for plants to time their fruiting to coincide with the migrations of birds. As you move further south, you find the flowering dogwood fruiting later and later in the season, which is again follows the migration of fruit-eating birds, especially the thrushes. The fruits of our native plants, like flowering dogwood, are just the right size to easily go down the throat of birds like our thrushes, the robin being the largest of our common fruit-eating birds. There's none of these plants which are swallowed by birds, native plants, more than 3/5 of an inch in diameter, because any fruits larger than that wouldn't be easily swallowed. Keep that in mind when horticulturists recommend Coosa dogwood instead of flowering dogwood. Its fruits are fused together, and they're way too large for our native birds to swallow. Color is another thing that plants have evolved to attract birds. The colors only appear just at the right time. And yet, there are bird-distributed plants like, here's gray dogwood, which has white fruits and red stems, and it seems to violate some of these principles of bird attracting, but it only shows the variation in how plants signal their fruits for birds. Here's a gray dogwood with the white fruits contrasting against red leaves. These plants have not evolved red fruits. It's a bird-distributed plant, but they have evolved an enzyme in their leaves that kills the chlorophyll just when the fruit is ripe. Before the fruit is ripe, the leaves are green, and the plant is not trying to attract the birds. Here's another example. Virginia creeper. Its fruits are black. They wouldn't show up at all against green leaves and the dark shadows. But when those fruits are ready, in other words, when the seeds are mature inside, the plant is trying to attract birds. Trying is, we don't think about plants trying too hard, but functionally that's the result. Evolution has led and selected toward plants that are providing their fruits at just the right time, just the right size, and in tasty, nutritious ways to attract varieties of birds. Washington hawthorn is one of my favorite bird-attracting trees. It's got all the things that you hope for in a bird-attracting tree. It's long-lived. It has fruits. It has great nesting structure. That is, the branches are great. They provide a lot of forks to provide nest cups, to support nest cups of birds. And it's got thorns to keep predators out. So it's a great choice for bird attracting. But look at these green fruits sort of hiding among the leaves. And then in the fall, the leaves turn and fall. The fruits are plump and they're full, and they look like the birds would come, but often this plant still is holding its fruits into the fall. Horticulturists like this because it's a showy color in our winter landscape. But you might say, what happened to the birds? Where are the birds? Why didn't they eat these? Because if you plant these, the birds often won't show up. Here's another example. High bush cranberry viburnum has got all the attributes, the right size, the right timing for fruit, plump, abundant fruits, but quite often high bush cranberry is not eaten by birds in the fall or early winter. But come spring, it is eaten. So if you plant this kind of winter persistent fruits, you'll find that it will feed birds in the winter. Why? Because if you diagnose the fruits, these are low-fat fruits. There's hardly any lipids in these fruits. These plants have a strategy for attracting birds in the off-season. And this way they're not competing with the high-fat fruits And as a landscaper, it's good to plant both high-fat fruits and low-fat fruits to attract birds at different seasons. Here's another low-fat fruit flowering crab apples, many varieties. If you are selecting crab apples to plant, avoid those varieties that look more like apples. They're too large for native birds to swallow. Prefer the smaller seeded fruits, especially the winter persistent ones that will hang on there for waxwings and pine grosbeaks like this. Thinking about plants through the seasons, think about the spring. There's lots of kinds of plants that you can put up in the spring. Service berries are important. This is a black cherry. There's our grosbeaks feeding the chicks cherries in the spring. So there's a little bit of background to consider. That's part of the reason why it's important to plant a variety of things. Now here's a new development, part of that growing wave of suburbia that is spreading across the country, destroying habitats, vast habitats. But what is really wrong here? I mean, we look at this and we say, well, this does not look like a very bird-friendly habitat, but exactly why is that? Well, I think the main reason for this is that this lacks layers. A new development with all the trees and shrubs and vines are removed is almost a two-dimensional plane. Functionally, it's a two-dimensional plane with a few rock outcrops. That's what a bird might see. But that lacks the various layers that a bird really would like. And most of our birds actually live in forests. Most of our land birds are perching birds. They have 3 toes in the front and 1 behind. They need a branch to perch on. So if for no other reason, you can see this is really lacking the layering. It also illustrates the obsession that much of this country has with lawns. Lawn is one of the least useful habitats for birds. In fact, it can be a toxic habitat for birds. An estimated 7 million birds die every year on lawns that have been soaked with lawn chemicals. And of course, those chemicals don't stay in the lawns. They run off into the drains and into water, municipal water supplies. They run down into the groundwater. They get onto children's clothing and on their skin that are playing outside. Clean lawns, safer lawns are easily recognized by the diversity of plants in them. So you can tell if a lawn has been treated with herbicides very quickly if it's just grass, that's a real warning. There's a big problem for birds and people that are associated with that kind of habitat. I encourage landowners who have enough land to reduce the size of lawn, and the simplest thing to do is just let it grow up. There are ways to replace it with native warm season grasslands, and that's a difficult process, time-consuming. It can be more useful for birds, but just letting the lawn grow up, old lawn, reducing lawn is one approach of this, and it provides habitat. On our property up on Snyder Hill, the previous landowner was an obsessive lawn addict, unfortunately, and he had way too much lawn for our taste. We've just let the lawn grow up through most of it, and we put up a split rail fence near the house, and we do mow the lawn near the house. My advice to people who have yards and lawns, if you let the whole lawn grow up, your neighbors probably will think you moved out, and you won't be understood easily. It's much more appropriate to have a plan, to look like you still live there, to have some sense of order remaining. But you can do that by simply mowing around the house and mowing the edges of the property. Along our entrance driveway, we let it grow up beyond those maple trees I showed you before, but we still mow it near the edge, and because it's shaded, the grass doesn't grow much there anyways. But it still looks like we live there. I know other people that have let their lawn grow up, and they mow a pathway through it with a sign that says "Nature Trail," And so they basically are letting people know that there's a plan, there's some order and organization, and I think that's it's easier transition for people to understand. So I mentioned learning lessons from nature. There's one take-home lesson that I hope you'll remember about a lesson from nature, and that is this business of layers. Our tropical forests around the world, one of the reasons they are so diverse in species is that they are extremely complex and layered. Our native North American temperate forests and shrublands are also layered communities, and birds require all these different layers. They obtain different things from them. They may obtain nest materials from the ground covers right up to the canopies and from substories. They obtain things like nest building materials from vines and grasses. Where in natural habitats, where habitats come together, shrubs and trees of different conifers and deciduous trees and berry-producing shrubs, these are much more attractive bird habitats. In backyards and in parks, we can hope to mimic these more natural habitats by creating layers. And I'll give you a few examples of places I've seen where this has been successful. Here's a place in Ithaca in a more older community where the lawns have been replaced by different kinds of ground covers. Foundation plants are encouraged around the house to soften the hard corners of the house, and conifers and deciduous trees are permitted to grow up. There's older parts of this city where you can get up in a high building and look out in the summer and you don't even see the houses because the canopy is closed. It's connected. And there are vireos and there are woodpeckers living in those older communities. Every species of bird has different layers that it requires. And here's an example. The chipping sparrow is a relatively simple bird to satisfy. It requires some close cropped ground covers or bare soil, some lawn. It needs some shrubs like this bird is nesting, some taxus in this case. But it also needs tall trees to sing from. If it doesn't have a tree over 20 feet or doesn't have a shrub to nest in like this, you won't have chipping sparrows. Every species has its layers that it requires. And as we simplify the habitat, as we create more like clean parks, more tidy backyards, you lose layers, you lose structure, you lose all the variation that birds prefer. Here's a couple illustrations to show some changes that you can make. On paper, of course, it's much easier to garden on paper. Mistakes are simpler and you can erase them there. And I encourage, especially in the winter months, to put down on paper what you've got to start with. If you're lucky enough to have some water or a pond, great. That's vital. Large trees, it takes a long time for trees to grow. So I encourage people to work with the large trees that they have, especially the native species, and then to reduce lawn. So here's another picture of the same property. The lawn has been reduced. The high grass surrounds much of the former lawn. The vegetation has been brought up close to the house. An interesting phenomenon about many kinds of birds is they actually prefer to nest closer to the house than they do away. And the reason for that is that they're probably safer from predators around a house. Raccoons and skunks and whatnot, they may live around the edges of the property, but they usually, unless you're providing food, they don't usually come up on the deck. Birds know this. That's why if you wonder why is it that a bird will nest right over your door or right next to a window, it's because they're safer there. The plants in this picture here are planted not as single specimen plants, but as clumps. It's much more successful to plant groups of plants because they cross-pollinate each other, and when they're fruiting, they provide functionally one large productive plant. So those are some general ideas. Tall plants are typically planted around the edges of the property. Deciduous trees are typically planted on the south side of a house, so they provide shade and cooling in the summer and open sunlight in the winter when people most want it. Conifers are better planted on the north side of the house to block prevailing cold northern winds, and those are energy conservation ideas as well. When you're arranging plants on the landscape, it's important to try to create this tiered effect for a couple of reasons. The main reason is that plants don't grow very well under the shade of well-established trees. So if you're adding trees and shrubs, it's better to add them in this direction. Also, visibility from the house, you can see what's going on as you look out over this stepwise effect. A single tree is much more attractive to birds if it has got a cluster of various leveled shrubs and vines under it. And a word about those vines. Vines are often an overlooked part of a bird community. Many birds require vines, not just for the fruit, like on this grape, but the grape is especially useful because the bark shreds, and there's about 16 species of common birds, including cardinals and most of our vireos, that require grapevine to build their nest, and that may limit whether you have them or not. Again, thinking different scales on even small properties, changes of elevation at a micro level are very important to birds. Here's a project where several barrels of soil were just piled up into a heap, but they were planted with some shrubs on top, some rocks and logs on both sides. These provide microclimates to favor things like spiders and ants, which will then lure small ground-feeding birds. Cavities often limit the distribution of birds. Natural cavities, such as this bluebird is using, are increasingly scarce, in part because our forests are very young. Most of the forests that are growing up in eastern North America especially are changing from shrublands to forest. The trees are not big enough yet to have mature cavities in them. And so what do? If you have woods, it's important to look at that and see whether there are any dead trees. Dead snags are vital for attracting woodpeckers. Woodpeckers use these for drumming. And without drumming trees, they may drum on your house, which drives some people crazy, but you can attract more woodpeckers by creating some drumming trees, and that's what's going on at the top with girdling. And the guy on the bottom is creating, these are inexpensive ways to create cavities. You just, with a power drill, you go and drill holes into dead trees or short-lived trees like poplars. There are many things that fall down on properties that are hauled away to the roadsides, and branches and shrubs that fall off trees it's a waste to take these away. It's better to keep them on the land to create a brush pile, and that's what's happening here. Some structures at the top of the picture, and then pile it up every year. Just keep piling more and more brush up, and small birds find shelter. There's living brush piles illustrated below. Lower branches are lopped, but they're not removed. They're still connected, so these branches are still alive. Here's some trees that were lopped over to create a brush pile. These can be tied together, and this will last for years as these trees grow and create cover for birds. People often wonder what happens after a storm. Where do the birds go? Well, they may leave properties completely, or they may die. But this kind of low-to-the-ground cover is vital for birds in storms. Here's another thing that you see a lot of in the fall. The valuable leaves are raked up and they're put in bags, and the cities haul these away. We do it here in Ithaca, but I encourage people to keep those valuable leaves on their property. Here's one idea. You rake the leaves up onto a tarp and you just rake them under shrubs. And then they will decompose into a mulch, and they'll enrich the shrubs, and they'll provide places for long-legged birds like thrashers and white-throated sparrows to scratch. You won't see thrashers and sparrows scratching in turf grass, the dense lawn, but they will scratch under shrubs. And if you add these leaves there, you'll create ideal places for invertebrates to live, and that's why these long-legged scratching birds like sparrows and towhees will be feeding. Many birds like to use dust baths, especially sparrows. This dust bath recipe is an equal mixture of ash and sand and loam, equal amounts. You can dig a depression in the ground in a sunny spot, mix this up, and birds will come and clean themselves. Oddly enough, they get dirty. They clean themselves by getting dirty. What's with that? Well, it's removing ectoparasites off of their feathers by ruffling them up and removing some scale from new growing feathers. They like it. It feels good to do this. There are many kinds of plants that people plant as yard plants that are a problem in natural habitats, and they're what are called invasives. Here's barberry, Japanese barberry. It is still sold commonly in most nurseries. It's a runaway plant. There are many examples of it that are creating monocultures across the land. Multiflora rose is famous, but buckthorn and bush honeysuckles often were brought here by groups like the Soil Conservation Service, and they've become huge monocultures of invasive plants. It's odd because they are feeding birds, but the birds distribute them over the landscape. They thrive really well in our climates, and eventually they crowd out the natives. And as I mentioned before, native birds need a variety of native plants for the reasons I mentioned: the right time, the right nutrition. Variety of food is key to birds. Monocultures of invasives preclude that. There's another thing going on in our cities that is worth being aware of. Here's a beautiful little tree called the Bradford pear. This is a cultivated tree that has been planted, and it looks like the perfect little lollipop tree. And it's a very popular plant by many horticulturists. Our airport here in Ithaca, when it was remodeled, they planted the whole thing with Bradford pear. Some of our streets in this town and across the country are being planted with Bradford pear. And it's the reason that it's planted, it grows well. It's got this perfect shape to it. In the spring, it's covered in white blooms. It's a beautiful plant. And then it produces fruits. The only problem is that the fruits are inedible to birds. The tree is relatively short-lived. Most of them are going to need to be replaced by something. And it has very poor structure for birds to build nests in. So it's basically not helping birds at all. What I would encourage people to do is to take native plants and to use these. Here's that Washington hawthorn, a native tree that has fruit, holds it through the winter, thorns to keep predators away, great nesting structure. Here's red cedar, a native tree planted near a house, providing all the benefits that it does. Here's river birch, another native tree that provides huge, abundant seed crops for chickadees and warblers. Bayberry is another native shrub that's excellent. I could go on recommending native plants, and I won't. I'll just show you a few more of my favorites. This is one of many kinds of viburnums. This is arrowwood viburnum, which shows not just abundant fruits, but look at the gorgeous colors to the leaves. You know, why bring in plants from all over the world when our natives are ignored? Our natives are more honored in some other countries than they are here. Virginia creeper is planted widely in France. It may be causing a problem there, but here we should plant it. Look at these beautiful purple fruits of the silky dogwood. It's a long waiting plant to really thrive in backyards. Winterberry has become more popular as a horticultural plant, and it holds its fruits well into the winter, which is how it got its name, and feeds lots of birds, just the right size fruits. Spicebush is a native understory plant. In areas where deer are a problem, spicebush is one of the few plants that is not chewed by deer because of the aromatic leaves that deter deer. Well, a word about deer. Because they are abundant, they will eat your valuable plants that you plant. And so whether it's deer or whether it's mice or whether it's rabbits, in some cases beavers, you can't just plant things and expect the job to be over. This is really a question of, restoration is really a question of gardening at various scales. And so I want to just mention a few of the problems that people encounter. And deer are one of those. And I could probably talk the whole afternoon about what to do about this particular problem. I'll just mention that a lot of the research points to fencing and exclusion is probably the best solution, either around particular plants or around properties, but the fence has to be at least 8 feet tall to keep deer from bounding into it. But planting plants which are either too prickly or have strong scents is another approach, and that's a way to go. There's also various things you can put on plants to keep deer from eating it, especially soon after they're planted. And those deer deterrents made or containing at least the smell of rotten eggs, the research points. Deer don't like rotten eggs. Okay. Windows. Probably the number one problem for attracting birds near houses. It's estimated over 1 billion birds a year hit plate glass in this country. A lot of times people don't even know it's happening. The bird hits, it bounces off, it may fly away, but it may have a concussion, it may die further away. Some things have been tried, like that silhouette up on the window. This picture was taken of our old lab window when we tried a variety of things. And the research now points to the fact that those silhouettes on windows are ineffective. If just put one up, you might as well paint a black spot on the window. You would have to put those about 3 inches apart over the window to really have any effect. And they have to be on the outside of the window to have any effect. So things on windows are really not very effective in general. What is effective is some sort of a cover over the window. And here's a case in point where mesh window screen mesh has been put over the window to, if a bird hits this, it bounces off. The other thing that with window collisions has happened is that the research shows that feeders that are within 3 feet of windows are much safer than feeders that are further away. Within 3 feet or more than 30 feet. Because if a bird flies up scared by a hawk, for example, within 3 feet, it won't gather much momentum if the feeder is very close. So if the feeders are further away, the windows should be protected, or they should be more than 30 feet away. Well, there's other things to worry about too. For example, if a bird hits the window and then falls stunned to the ground, it may fall prey to outside cats. But there are solutions to this, and Alyssa is going to tell us some of these solutions.